So now we're going to jump right into a description, a little overview of these South African Australopithecines or South African Australopithecus. Holding in my hand right here in this image is the original specimen, the type specimen, which means that it is the one that was given, first fossil that was given the name Australopithecus africanus, the Tong baby that was found or revealed in 1924. And you can see that it's a child, sometimes called the Tong baby or Tong child, because it has a mixture of immature dentition, baby teeth or deciduous teeth, as well as adult or permanent teeth. So, the man responsible for this was the late Raymond Dart, pictured here holding the original specimen. He died in 1988. I knew him for quite a number of years, and it was always a joy to travel to Johannesburg to see him or to see him here in the United States. Raymond Dart was an Australian who studied in Britain and studied anatomy, particularly aspects of brain anatomy, and was sent out to Johannesburg in the 1920s to develop a medical school. Can you imagine? At the University of Witwatersrand, and it is still one of the best medical schools in all of Africa. And during his tenure there, he had a student who brought him some skulls of fossil baboons. And he said, where did you get those? And she said, well, there's a mining operation in a place called Tong, and they're finding these kinds of things. And he said, well, just have them save the bones and send them to me. So they'd throw them in a wooden box, and they'd get shipped back from Tong to Johannesburg, and he would look through the boxes. And one day, as he was getting ready to be a best man in a wedding in his tuxedo, he opened up this box, and he saw something that startled him. And he said, this is not a baboon, this is something else. And he did go to the wedding, but for the next several months, this was in late 1924, he used his wife's knitting needles to pry away the stone. And what was revealed was this face, and the fact that there was a lower jaw attached to the upper jaw. And he worked and he worked and he worked on this, and he realized that this was not a baboon, it was not an ape, it was probably a human ancestor. So in 1925, he published in the journal Nature, an international science journal, one of the most prestigious, a story, an article about the Tong baby, or the Tong child. It's probably around 2.5 million years old. We don't know because he didn't find it in situ, remember? It was blasted out by lime workers. But he pretty much knew the deposits, and this is based on a number of things which we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about dating. And he published in Nature, and he called it Australopithecus, not because he was an Australian, as some people think, but because Australo means southern, right? And this was in southern Africa. And unfortunately, he called it Pithecus. It's not an ape. Maybe he should have called it Australanthropus, which would have been southern man, southern Africa man. But he called it Australopithecus. He gave it a species name, Africanus, referring to Africa. So it's actually the southern ape of Africa. Somewhat of a misnomer, but because it was proposed properly, because it was accepted by the scientific community, it has been in general use, it stays that way. You cannot change the name of it. It's like trying to change the name of a child when it becomes an adult. There is a place called Tong, unbelievably. I went there about 25 years ago. It was amazing. Here's the local general store right by the railroad station. And you can tell that Tong's a pretty small town since the phone number of this place is 6. But at any rate, it was fun making the pilgrimage out there to see this vast site that was being mined. And it's the only human fossil ever found at that site. Some people think it actually was dropped in by an eagle. There are certain marks in the orbits that suggest that there are claw marks of one of these large eagles that could easily lift a child and dropped it into maybe one of these shafts. Well, so what's it look like? This is what it looks like. It didn't have an ape-like brow. Okay, you remember looking at chimps and gorillas, how they have very big brow ridges at the top. It didn't have a very projecting face. It had a fairly flat face. And most importantly, he was able to see where the foramen magnum was. And the foramen magnum was at the bottom of the skull. So it meant, not at the back, but at the bottom, it meant that this was from an upright creature. And this is what really convinced him that this belonged on the human family tree and not the ape family tree. He also looked at various crenulations. You can see what is called an endocast. You see, once this creature fell into the cave, water moved in fine-grained sediments and filled the brain case and molded itself against the inside of that brain case, which bears the crenulations of the brain. And there's a particular sulcus, a little groove, that he thought was very different from apes and more like humans. And these endocasts play a very interesting role. So here's a close-up photo I made of the Tong child's lower jaw or mandible. And what we're looking at are 1, 2 baby incisors, right? Deciduous teeth. This is the first deciduous or baby or milk tooth, canine, the first deciduous or milk tooth molar, and the second deciduous. This beautiful tooth is the first adult molar. So if this were a modern human jaw, and we were doing forensics, we would say, this child died at around age 6. Well, as I said, recent work on the speed of these layers of enamel that are laid down like tree rings can be established. And this child was probably around 3 or maybe 4, but around 3 or 4 years old when it died. Well, it caused an enormous explosion, particularly in Britain, and especially with people who Dart had studied with. Sir Arthur Keith, who will reappear later, was one of Britain's most outstanding anatomists, and he objected strenuously to this. And he had one good point, and that was that this was an immature specimen. It was a child. How do we know what it was going to grow up to? Keith said it was going to grow up into a chimpanzee, that this was a young chimpanzee. That's why it had a flat face. That's why it was more ape-like than human-like. But he didn't take into consideration the position of the foramen magnum and so on and so forth. But it was an immature specimen, and we try to use adult specimens because if you look at a human child and an ape child, or an ape baby, an ape infant, they look much more similar. As they grow older, they look very, very different. So they both have that sort of infantile kind of face, this kind of pedomorphic aspect. Well, if we look at this in the historical context, there were a number of other reasons that Keith and others were very upset. They said, Dalt has published much too quickly. He has digested and studied this. And they said, well, Africa's the wrong place. You're supposed to find a creature with a large brain. This has a small brain. And as we all know, humans began in Europe because this Eurocentric view that Europe was a finishing school for humanity that we will look at in more detail. He mixed his Latin and his Greek. Good heavens. Well, he did it correctly, so they couldn't really take that away from him, but they thought it should all be in Latin, not part Latin and part Greek. And he wasn't a paleontologist, he was an anatomist. So what does he know about fossils? Well, you know, the present is the key to the past. If you're not a good anatomist, you're not going to be able to understand the fossils. And of course, the biggest mistake at that time was he didn't consult with his elders and get their opinions. Dart went off on his own and published The Tong Child. Well, enter one of the more colorful characters in the study of human origins, Robert Broom, a Scotsman who was a physician and an outstanding paleontologist. He used to get people so upset in South Africa, he'd walk into a museum, there'd be a fossil on display, could be a mammal-like reptile, he knew a lot about those, and he'd just look at it and say, it's a new species. And he'd try to get the curator to open the case to look at it, and the curator didn't want to do it. So Broom would just look through the class and make the observations and publish it, and he turned out virtually always to be correct. And between his attending to sick people, he went out and started looking for new sites. But first, he went to the medical school at Witwatersrand, and he knocked on Dart's door. The Tong baby was sitting on Dart's desk, and he walked in and he fell down to his knees and he said, I have come to pay homage to our oldest ancestor. Because he knew that that was a bona fide human ancestor, a hominin, or as hominids as they were called in those days. And he was a great supporter of Dart's work. It ultimately really took one of the great anatomists and biologists, Wilfred Le Gros Clark, who visited South Africa. He actually came to see original Australopithecus fossils and said, these are not apes, these are human ancestors. And if you go to the site of Sterkfontein, you will see at the entrance this wonderful bronze sculpture with Robert Broom looking adoringly onto one of his favorite fossils, which was Mrs. Plez. Broom had an interesting perspective. He thought virtually everything he found was a new genus and a new species. At Sterkfontein, after the discovery of Tong, where he worked with John Robinson in 1936, he named Plesianthropus transvalensis. Thought it was a whole new thing. Today, we don't use that name anymore, and we call these fossils from Sterkfontein Australopithecus africanus. These are adult forms of the Tong baby. And he called it Plesianthropus, which means near man, and that's why certain fossils are called, like this skull, which is Mrs. Plez. That's where the name Plez comes from, when he called it Plesianthropus. But all of these, close to 1,000 probably now, are all placed in that particular genus and species, Australopithecus africanus. So Sterkfontein, very important site, still discovering things at Sterkfontein. And if one is in South Africa, one can go to Sterkfontein and take a tour and go down into this cave and see some of the places where the fossils were found and look at wonderful displays. They were very fortunate in finding part of a skeleton. I wish I had found that much of a backbone of Lucy's. We didn't, but it does have a pelvis, and this pelvis clearly shows that Australopithecus africanus was upright and bipedal. So what we will do in the following presentation is look at more of these sites and more variation in the genus Australopithecus.